very much. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, particularly in this 150th year. It's very good, and I must say that since I've become a dean, I'm now sponsored by Nurofen, so it is rather good to get out, if I'm honest, and remind myself that I'm a priest and a reader of poetry as much as a chief executive of a registered charity, which is what it can sometimes feel like. So thank you, because I think I'm going to enjoy it probably more than you, but let's see. I want to talk about poetry because for me it is the native language of faith. It's very difficult, I think, at the moment to find a language for the soul, particularly when to speak of faith without blushing is rare. And people are trying to find credible, plausible language with which to share very intimate beliefs. But we're in an age that is automatically suspicious. And so I've done a lot of thinking over my 30 years of ordained life. And for me, the only way really I can make sense to myself, never mind to anybody else, of religious language, of the language of faith, is to see it as poetry. And when you walk into a church, and I felt this very much tonight at your 6:30 Mass, when you walk into a church, I think you are walking into a poem. And if you want to say, well, that sounds a bit romantic, a bit sort of, Radio 4, what do I mean? Well, everything you do, from the moment you step in to the moment you step out, has poetry involved. Except we often forget. So if you go to a sung mass, say on a Sunday morning, one of the first things that will happen is that you'll stand up and you'll sing. What are you singing? You're singing a poem. We call it a hymn. And then words will be said by the priest, collect, spoken. The language of that is often poetic. It is not literalistic. Then you have a psalm, which of course is an old poem. And then you'll hear the scriptures. If you're hearing the Old Testament, you'll hear quite often the prophets, who are using very poetic language, as prophets always do. Martin Luther King, who I often say this to people at the cathedral, Martin Luther King never once said, I have a nightmare. He said, I have a dream, a vision, I have a promised land of the people we might yet become. And in order to invite people into that promised land, he became poetic. And if you go to his sermons, his speeches, time and time again, it reflects the Old Testament prophets. Of course, the Old Testament is full of poetry, the Psalms, of course, the language of Job, the Song of Songs, and so on. Then you go to the New Testament, and you find the crucial figure of Jesus Christ, who was persistently figurative. He probably would have got B- at our seminary in preaching class, because people were always running after him, we're told, and saying, that was lovely, or what did it mean? It was because he was being figurative, and difficulty is an important, I'll come back to this, difficulty is an important part of poetry. And then in the Anglican tradition, of course, we have the very strong, continuous tradition of the poet-priest. And for me, this... Welcome, hello. I'm just talking about poet priests, and you walked in. For me, poetry and Christian faith are entwined together, and the Christian faith becomes enlarged and enriched when you can settle back into that and not get sort of apologetic about it. If at the end of the day you say, well, why is this? For me, it's because, and I don't know how many of you are in love at the moment. I mean, I'm looking at you. Some of you have flushed faces. Perhaps you are in love at the moment. Perhaps it was the soup. I don't know. But if you're in love, the last thing you are is a literalist. If you want to express your love to somebody, you become acrobatic with your language. You take your language to the gym. And if you've ever come across some love letter you once wrote on a forlorn wet night when you were a teenager, there you will find, often very embarrassing to read it again, but you'll see how you were stretching language to try and capture something of the passion that you felt. Now, if poetry is the language of love, and we are a community, that a school, I often think the church is a school for loving better, then this is our language. If you're trying to love God, if you're trying to love your neighbour, then it seems to me that poetry is going to be our natural language, because we need it to go to the gym, we need it to be acrobatic, we need it to be exploratory. And all the religious traditions, it's not just the Christian one, but all the religious traditions have known this. And we could look at lots of other religions and discover that poetry is there at the core of their religious writings. So I call this Lent series of talks Snowfall in the Soul. For me, that is a very good description of Lent. It is some sort of snowfall in the soul, where your inner landscape is asked just to be distilled for a bit, to quieten down. But Wallace Stevens, who is an American poet in the 20th century, he said once in a letter to a friend, we ought to like poetry the same way that children love the snow. I don't know what he meant by that quite, but the image sticks with me in that when I was a boy in Shropshire and the snow had fallen and I woke up, I was very excited and I pulled back the windows. That view that you have outside your bedroom window was completely changed. The landscape you knew had gone. Everything was covered in snow. And you quickly dress and you run out and you see the breath, you see your breath in the cold air, and you can't see where the path is and you have to sort of make a new one. Now this, to me, is how we talk about poetry. There is something about what it does to your ordinary landscape. It distills it. It helps you see it from a different angle. You can see your breath in the sense that you become more attuned to your own self. And you can begin to work out different routes, as it were. The so what question. Okay, I've read this poem, so what? But you can often feel that it has some effect on your priorities, on your values. And therefore, it shouldn't surprise us that poetry is often also, just in case you think that it's a sort of hobby for the refined, it's actually very essential to, hospice work. If you want to explore values and meaning when people are dying, poetry will often be used. It can be used in the prison service with inmates. It can be used at weddings. It can be used in protests, very creatively sometimes. When I was in the States, I went to see a street shrine that had been set up where a black guy had been shot and killed, and there it all was, the sort of candles, the flowers, and these sort of boards that people had written. And I remember one, and it simply said, you tried to bury me, you forgot I am a seed. And I thought, that's poetic. This is voicing protest. And I looked up that little line, and indeed it was first written by a Greek poet who was gay and was suffering discrimination. But then it was passed down to a Mexican community who was seeking liberation, and they used the same 2 lines of poetry. And so poetry is also there in protest and in liberation. It's not just bad memories of us all remembering, the school room where we were humiliated because we couldn't remember the poem or we couldn't understand it. And that's the thing I also just want to mention before we start looking at one particular poet, is I do realise that poetry is a very scary language for some people because it has really bad memories attached to it, usually from school. Those of you who can remember Blackadder actually says to Baldric, "Baldric, I'd prefer to French kiss a skunk than read your poem." And people often have that view about poems. They think that it's something not for them, it's too difficult, you don't get many words for your money when you buy a poetry book, there's a lot of space everywhere. And sometimes I think people give it a go again. They go to Waterstones, they pull off an anthology, have a quick look, and it's difficult. It's language, but not as we know it. The meaning isn't immediate, and of course at the moment we love immediate click information. And so the book is often put back, and people say, "Oh, it's just not for me, I don't do poetry." The difficulty factor, I think, is really important because, as you know, you only need to think about your own life, that the most important times in your life are often the difficult ones. Those were the times where, as I often say, your hard little full stop in life was being turned into a comma. And therefore the difficulty in a poem is often part of it, of sort of crucial, essential work of it. And it's a bit like going to an art gallery, you look at a picture, and you say, "I haven't got a clue what that is." But sometimes you still stay with it. And there is this sense that even if you can't make sense of this, there is something about it that seems to be making sense of you. So you stick around to see what happens. And there is, again, something in that about the good poem, that meaning isn't immediate, but you can respond to it in some way, even if it's to say, "I find this difficult, don't know what's going on," but somehow it's starting to shift some stones in you. And I called a book I wrote a few years ago now about poetry and faith, I called it The Splash of Words, because it seems that quite often that's how a poem works. You throw the poem into the water and there is this ripple, and these ripples of the poetry head out to the shore. And so the work of the poem is the splash, but the work continues, and then it starts to shift the landscape a bit. So it isn't always immediate, and as I say, we are in an immediate, rather breathless society, but this is a language with which you have to be a bit more patient and let its work happen slowly. When an Irish poet called Michael Longley was once asked, as I think a lot of artists are, poets and so on, "Where does all your poetry come from? You know, all these wonderful images, and where does it all come from?" And he said, "If I knew where poetry came from, I'd go and live there." And I think there is a strong sense that even though it feels like a distant land, it also feels more like home. And there is something in the work of a poem that can draw you, that is invitational, and that you sense possibility. And it might be the possibility for you to shift a bit or change or get a new perspective. And that's always an exciting, adventurous thing. So for me, poetry is also an adventure. There's my little... we could come back to any of that a little bit later, but that's my introduction for this series, because I just think we all need to be poets in residence as Christians. I think that's one of our tasks, is to remind people of a reverence for language, because this is a bumper sticker society at the moment, and we're all asked to be this or that, and to encapsulate everything in sort of small slogans. But life, thank God, is not really like that. And poetry is a language, I think, that is more serious about encapsulating the depths of reality, not the surfaces. And even the church, of course, can be tempted to be living on the surface and prefer the surface. And I'm afraid sometimes for me, the result of that is that a spiritually searching society ends up finding the church to be too secular. And yet we have a wonderful, rich tradition, which is poetic and which we can offer. And I also think, of course, that poetry gets embodied even into our movements, and we call it sacramentals, but even our bodies become poetic in church. If you go to HTB, you'll put your hands up like this. If you say Mass here, you will put your hands up like this. You go into the vocative. So we become poets in motion as well. So there's a little introduction to poetry. And what I want to do in these 5 sessions with you is to look at 5 particular poets. I've been very selfish and blatant about it. I've just picked poets I like. And I hope that something of my own like of them will just, make its way towards you. Today I'm going to look at George Herbert. I'm going to do 2 metaphysical poets. So George Herbert this week. I'm not going to name them all now. I'll keep you on the edge of your seat. But I'm going to do 2 metaphysical poets. I'll do a 19th century poet, a 20th century poet, and then I'm going to look at a contemporary poet. And each night that we meet, I'll give a little introduction to the poet, and then we'll look at 1 or 2 poems together. And I know this is where you start shifting in your seat, thinking, oh my goodness me, I've got to do something. I'm not going to ask much of you. But at a couple of points in the evening, we will read a poem, and then I will ask you just to very gently turn to your neighbour to see what you both made of the poem. And there won't be any examination at the end of it, or any tests. You won't need to stand up and tell everybody. But I would like you to start engaging with what we've just read. So let me start on tonight, George Herbert. Most of you maybe have heard of George Herbert. Most of you perhaps know his work well. He was born in Montgomery in 1593. He was born into a rather well-to-do family. He was educated at Cambridge, next door to where I was. I was working at St John's College. He was next door at Trinity, not at the same time, by the way. And he did rather well. He was a very bright student, and he was elected to a fellowship at Trinity. He became eventually the orator of the university, so he was translating all the official documents and speeches of the university into Latin. He was admired very much by the king. He became an MP for a very short while, and it was very clear that a sort of glittering court career may well have been on the cards. But something happened. We don't quite know what. A contemporary said of him that, and I quote, "He did not manage his brave parts to his best advantage and preferment, but lost himself in a humble way." So instead of pursuing elevations in the university or in the court, because as I say, the king took a shine to him, Herbert puts himself forward to be ordained as a priest in the Church of England. And John Williams, who actually was at St John's College next door, was made a bishop, and he ordains him. Although we get this very strong sense that George Herbert was, the priest of perfection in the Church of England, and people have this very strong view that he must have been a very wonderful priest for so many years. Actually, he was a priest for 3 years. He died when he was in his 40th year. He died of tuberculosis. But for those last 3 years of his life, he served as a country rector in 2 Wiltshire villages near Salisbury. And you can go and visit the church that he went to every morning with his family in Bemerton. How many of you have been to Bemerton? Yeah, it's a rather special little place. You take your life in your hands when you go into the church because of the road that goes around the tiny little church. And his rectory is still there. It's owned by the novelist Vikram Seth, and the rectory is right opposite the church. And I was very lucky last year to go and have a look at it and see the garden and so on. It's very beautiful, but you can't just go and force your way around the rectory, but you can go into the church. It's the church, as I say, that Herbert and his wife and his niece and family prayed in every day, and he also took a walk, rather famously, twice a week, from Salisbury, from his house in Bemerton to Salisbury Cathedral to attend evensong, and he'd often play music with his friends on the way home. He was a great musician, and you'll find a lot of musical imagery in his poetry. His body is buried in the chancel in this little church, but it's in an unmarked grave. Nobody knows where he is. And when I went there last year and I was being shown around by a man who had the key to the church, I just thought, oh, he's still lost in a humble way. There's no big tomb. There's nothing. He's just there somewhere. So he was known as a pastoral priest, but his poems are not about sheep in the fields and views. They're about God. He wrote about 170 poems. That's not too many. If you buy a collection of Herbert, it's not huge. It's about 170 poems. They are all about God. They're rather like the parables of Jesus in many ways, in that they're talking about God, but with very everyday imagery, accessible little doors that you can easily walk into and then find yourself talking about eternity or God. But very easy ways in to do that. The amazing thing about Herbert from a literary point of view is that he hardly repeats one poetic form twice. So nearly all the poems are written in a different form, different shape. And so each one feels fresh from the next one. You move on and it looks different, sounds different. There are lots of different ways in which his poetry works. One of the things that you often quickly discover is his love of the monosyllable. God doesn't say much in Herbert's poems, but when he does say something, it's usually monosyllabic. It's almost as if he's trying to sort of nail things in, and we'll look at a poem where a good example of that. He says that these poems are about, and I quote, the many spiritual conflicts that have passed betwixt God and my soul. Because what happened, and by the way, if you want to read a wonderful biography of Herbert, you can't really do better, I don't think, than the recent biography, which I've put on the back of the paper by John Drury, called Music at Midnight. But his first biographer was Isaac Walton, who also wrote one of John Donne, and it's wonderful to read, but historically a bit dodgy, we think. Not everything sounds quite right, but it is a beautiful tribute. And Isaac Walton says that when Herbert was ill, and he suffered with ill health a lot, And that's why when you look at pictures of him, he looks a bit ill. He looks as if he needs a hamburger or something to fatten him up a bit. But he did suffer with ill health a lot through his life. And when he really, I think, knew that the time was coming where he was going to leave this earth, he was 39, he wasn't quite 40. He collects together his poems, which none of them have been published. His Latin poems, he'd written a few Latin poems for Cambridge, which had been, but none of his English poems had been. He's written these poems throughout his life, but many of them have obviously come through in his later life around his Christian ministry. He collects them all up, he puts them in a bundle, but he doesn't just do that nonchalantly, he very, very carefully orders them. George Herbert was also one of the first poets to give poems titles. So the title is the first little key you're given into the poem for Herbert. And he takes these poems and he orders them, and he gives them to his friend. He sends them off to his friend Nicholas Ferrer, who's at Little Gidding, and he sends a note and he says, just take a look at these. If you think they've got any worth to them, I'll leave it with you. If you just think they're awful, just put them on the fire. And thankfully, Nicholas Ferrer was a discerning person and thought these were pretty special and didn't go anywhere near the fire. And after Herbert's death, publishes them, and they take off. They republish very quickly. They become very popular. And one of the beautifully marked things about his published poems is how universally loved they were. So we know that Charles I was reading George Herbert before his execution. We also know that the chaplain of Oliver Cromwell was commending George Herbert's poems to his friends. So in a very religiously divided world, Herbert was universally loved, which is no mean feat. Anyway, these poems are very carefully ordered, and I'll show you in a moment the very last poem that he puts at the end of his collection, almost as if this is the most important that I want you to keep with you. Although Herbert had written some prose, he wrote a few guidelines on how to pastor a community. He wrote a volume of proverbs. It's the poems for which he's known and loved. I think some of the poems are known by people because they've been sung as hymns and are well known as hymns. Let all the world in every corner sing. Teach me, my God and King. There's a couple of good examples. Literary scholars, and if you're really interested in honing in much more on the poems, again, I can't do better than to commend Helen Wilcox's. But you have to be serious about Herbert if you're going to buy Helen Wilcox. It's a whopping big volume, and she really goes into every poem in a very, I think, very exciting way. But this is serious stuff. She was my PhD supervisor, and I always commend her work because it is fascinating and very rewarding. But these literary critics often debate, and this is so sort of Oxbridge Towers, but you get this debate: is George Herbert a minor major poet or a major minor poet? And people differ about that. But as I say, one thing we do know is that he is undeniably popular and has been through the years. Herbert, like Donne and other metaphysical poets, went out of fashion late 17th century and came back into fashion largely thanks to T.S. Eliot, who started to focus in on it. But Samuel Taylor Coleridge said of George Herbert, "He helped me with my tendency to self-contempt." And we'll try and work out what he meant by that as we look at the poems. But I do think key to the popularity of Herbert, alongside this accessible language, there isn't that much difficulty in Herbert. If you're going to find something difficult, it's often because the word is unfamiliar and you feel, oh, it's a word from the 17th century, but not one we use today. The imagery is accessible. There's this creativity of form in which virtually no two poems imitate each other, and each poem is relatively brief. They're not long, extensive narrative poems. It's very much lyrical poetry here. And often the poem has a little finish surprise, a little epiphany that suddenly shifts everything that's already been happening in the poem. And you'll see this in a moment. Richard Baxter in 1681 said this: "George Herbert speaks to God like one that really believeth in God. Heart work and heaven work make up his books." Heart work and heaven work. This beautiful description. And I could do quite a long series on George Herbert and look at all the poems with you. Always remembering that prayer that I like to start these sort of sessions with, which is lead us not into interpretation. I don't want to interpret them for you. I want you just to respond to them. But I just want to, before we look at a poem, highlight a couple of things you might learn from him about the life of faith. For me, the first is honesty. The church talks a lot about truth and is pretty hopeless at honesty. But not with Herbert. You find a candour about himself, about his adolescent tempers, often with God, in which he often wants to stomp off and tell God where he can stick it. There is an audacious boldness and at times playfulness with God, which all instill the sense of Herbert's, in his own words, repining restlessness. There is a restlessness in Herbert's relationship with God. And Helen Vendler, who is a literary critic in America, she says what the amazing thing is about poems about God, particularly in this period, is that they're often vertical. Here's you, or the poet, there's God, and you address God up. She says what Herbert did is this, that God and he become horizontal. They become a friendship. They're talking honestly to each other. And there is, I think, something very true in this approach. There is this friend, and the beautiful thing about Herbert is that no matter what's going to come his way, no matter what they're going to talk about, argue over, he and God are always going to be friends. There's nothing that can stop it. So actually, because there's nothing that can stop it, he's bloody well going to say it and tell God what's up and what's wrong and why he's got it skewy. But at the same time, he's allowing God to have a word or two back. And this happens in the poems. So what I'm saying is, when you read Herbert, you've got his reverence and his rebellion. You've got his devotion and his sense of dereliction sometimes. You see this a poet who's unafraid to reason, but he's unashamed to worship. And he's honest about a clumsy, confused, and humbled faith. St. Ambrose once said that only a proud humanity can be saved by a humble God. And you get a very strong sense of a humble God who is seeking to make Herbert a little humbler. And that will be his salvation. The poems are often psalm-like then, because this is why people love psalms, is because of this honesty about God and the relationship. And here are a few little expressions that he uses just as an example of this honesty. He talks of his own crooked, winding ways, of his thoughts being a case of knives. People often think that was Philip Larkin who wrote that. It was Herbert. Talking about his thoughts being a case of knives. He prays for simplicity, that I may live. He refers to the poor expressions of his love, how sorry I am, of how he bustles in life, and how he gets through with long pretense. And he sometimes says, how do I treat God? I wouldn't treat my worst enemy like I treat God sometimes. He talks about his heartless breast, how he sometimes lives as if heaven were mine own, though sometimes to hell I fall. And yet, and many of you will know where this comes from, that wonderful sonnet he wrote on prayer, he says, and yet there is something understood. This honesty, I find, is the most invitational part of it. And these expressions sum up this restless relationship, the seasons of faith that he goes through. And if you look at your first poem, you'll see this so clearly laid out in Bittersweet. I'll just read it to you. Ah, my dear angry Lord, since thou dost love, yet strike, cast down, yet help afford, sure, I will do the like. I will complain, yet praise. I will bewail, approve, and all my sour, sweet days I will lament and love. There you get this, again, this sort of, I'm going to tell you, God, you seem to be nice to me and then you send something awful in my life. You cast down in order to pull me back up again. Well, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to complain, yet praise, bewail, approve, which means commend. And these are his sour, sweet days. Bittersweet, by the way, the title of the poem, was the name of an apple in Herbert's day. So you're instantly, if you know that, you're instantly made to think of Eden, where, of course, others were cast down but had help afforded them. And this beautiful use of the word yet. So if you look at lines 2, 3, 5, you've got yet. You do this, yet this, yet this, and then the final line, I will lament and love, not yet. So at the end of the poem, there is almost a sort of completion, an acceptance that actually it's not this or that or that or this. Actually, this is how it's going to be. I will lament and love. This is just how it is. And I'm at peace with it. And I hope, God, you are too. I will lament and love. And so you get this very strong sense of a relationship that has its seasons, like all our relationships do. And as, of course, relationships cause us to change, and relationships also change themselves over time. And so this restlessness and this longing and this candour all caught up in an 8-line poem. I just think that the other thing about Herbert is that he often uses musical imagery, quite often talking about his heart being tuned to heaven. He's trying to tune his heart like an instrument to the melody of heaven. And you get this very strong sense, I think, in him that God, is somebody he runs to like a parent he's slightly fallen out with, but now wants to give a hug to. But for all that, what he's trying to do is endlessly tune his heart. Herbert grows as and when his walls come down, when he learns not to replace the soul with the self. When Herbert feels he's falling apart, he's often, we discover, actually just falling into place. Like looking at the cross in Herbert, God is so often the question, not the answer. Relentlessly unpicking, unravelling our egos so that actually there may be space for the soul. And you get this very strong sense that Herbert is being uncovered and that Herbert knows that he's got a mask on. He talks about his pretense. One thing we do know about Herbert as a younger man, he loved clothes. He liked to be finely dressed. And actually you do find that quite often referred to in the poems. Man well dressed, it says in the sonnet about prayer. But actually what God is doing to Herbert is prizing the mask off the face, uncovering him, and saying, who are you beneath all that pretense? And he knows it, and he welcomes it, although it's uncomfortable. And I suppose in Herbert what you're discovering is salvation is the antidote to perfectionism and to self-observation. And God, who is, as I say, not very talkative in the poems, usually one word or tersely monosyllabic, is just being who God is and waiting for Herbert to catch up or catch on. So there's something very anticipatory about the God you find in a Herbert poem. There's one which isn't in our collection today, but he basically says, I've had enough, and he slams the board, which means a table, but could also be the altar, slams it, and he basically says, I'm off. I've had it with you. You promised me all this, and frankly, I've got it. So off I go. And he just goes off into this adolescent rant about how now he's free and he's going to, conquer the universe sort of thing. And just at the end of the poem, God just sort of says, child. And Herbert sort of goes, my Lord. It's basically the adolescent sounding off in the kitchen, and you just listen to it. And you say, you do know I love you, don't you? You can give this out. That sort of relationship. Autumnal adolescence is what we're dealing sometimes in him. And then you get some very beautiful, I would have printed The Flower if it wasn't one of the longer poems. But here he is in the poem called The Flower. Who would have thought my shriveled heart could have recovered greenness? It was gone quite underground, as flowers depart to see their mother root when they've blown, where they together all the hard weather, dead to the world, keep house unknown. And now, in age, I bud again. After so many deaths, I live and write. I once more smell the dew and rain, and relish versing. So you get little curtains pulled back, that actually he also has these moments of the relationship coming back again, and that his heart recovers greenness. When we go through the very tedious, long, ordinary time, and everybody's wearing green in church, and chasubles are green and everything's green, I often think of this. We're trying to recover greenness in our hearts. The second lesson about faith, I think, that you find in Herbert is found at that story about the end of his life. What happens is that he sends those 170 poems, he's put them in order, and the last one is the poem you'll discover on page 4. It's a very well-known poem. Simone Weil thought it was the most beautiful poem in the English language.
Who wrote that?
Simone Weil. She thought it was exquisite. The point about it is that the title is Love, and he makes it the final poem. It's as if he's saying love is always the final word for the Christian. And that whatever else you hear, if for instance, if you're hearing somebody interpret the scriptures and you can't hear the love between the lines, don't bother listening. Love has to be heard. And here he puts it right at the end of his collection. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to ask you simply to turn to your neighbour and just be honest about your response to it. The wonderful thing about poetry, it's a democracy. Everybody has an equal say, and nobody's wrong, okay? So whatever you say about it, it's fine. It's your response to it. And as I say, we're not going to be examining what you said. Love. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Would you just turn to your neighbour? What did you make of that poem? Do you enjoy talking about that poem? Yes. Something happens to poems when you start chatting about them. There's Maya Angelou, I think it was, who said the wonderful thing about when you read a poem together is we all listen to the same poem. You tell me what your response is, and you tell me your response, and you tell me it, and we pile them all together, and we all end up with one big interpretation that not one of us had. So it's a sort of corporate exercise. And the lovely thing about reading a poem is that, as W.H. Auden said, you never finish a poem, you can only abandon it. Because of this interpretation and response. And it is a bit like listening to a piece of music. If somebody said at the end of listening to, Piano Concerto by Beethoven, what was the meaning of that? You'd go, well, that's a bit of a silly question. The meaning is the music. And when you're reading a poem, all you're doing is trying to give the meaning that happened in you as you were hearing these words. It doesn't mean that everybody else has got to sign up to your interpretation, but it's a wonderful thing to pool them together and end up with this collage. So people do tend to enjoy talking about poems together. Does anybody want to make a comment or ask a question about this poem? Something that strikes you about it or affected you? Or anything really?
The meaning that Amanda and I teased out of this poem was that God's love is unconditional.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But however we are, God still loves us.
Yeah, but I teased out, mine was a bit different, that we're quite hostile to God, that through sin or, feeling sullied, we find him very difficult. And also he does say, well, I made your eyes, that they're looking at. I think that's a bit proprietorial, I thought. You know, you need a bit of space.
Yes. You didn't say it as playful, you know, who made the eyes but I, you know, sort of.
Well,
play.
well, that's a bit more I, but I think of I.
Sorry.
That's one of the very few jokes in a poem.
All right, well, who made the eyes but I?
Yes.
Yes, and he uses a word which is a rather modern word, shame. Where let my shame go. And there are people in this room who know a lot more about this than me, but you know, guilt is I've done something wrong. Shame is I am something wrong. And he calls himself unkind, ungrateful, which frankly we probably all are.
So it's self-judgment, really.
He's looking at himself, he's judging himself, and he's probably, it feels as if he just doesn't feel lovable.
Absolutely.
Which, you know, is not a rare thing. Yeah, but again, there's an honesty there, I think. He doesn't feel able to look up.
He did eat in the end. He said
Yes.
that, yeah, so he kind of got there.
And
That's
then-
what I love about the poem is the fact that it's this dichotomy between, yes, I want to come, but I don't feel good enough, and it's this tension
Yes.
between longing to receive it, but not being able to receive it, and
Yes.
and then the last line. Decided, sit and eat. He's got there. You know, at that moment, it's solved.
But you could actually push it even further after the first line and say, he's eating, but is he tasting?
That's it.
You know, so maybe there's even more after that final last line that he's got yet to, you know. Of course, there is a good example of the Herbert monosyllabics. So I did sit and eat. In fact, you must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. It's a very Herbert technique. Anything else about this poem? Yes.
The last two lines are also refer to the Eucharist. They refer to the Eucharist.
Yes.
The last two lines.
Yes, there's Eucharistic focus here, and also the parable that Jesus taught about the wedding feast and the guests failing to show up. The sort of parable overtones here. A certain man made a great supper and bade many, in the King James version, and there it is, love, bade me, welcome. So there are overtones with that. Herbert has a very strong ear, as all poets do, to the sounds of words. So at the beginning, you get a sprightly short syllable sequence. Love bade me welcome. But what does his soul do? Drew back, elongated, long monosyllables. Guilty of dust and sin, but quick-eyed love. Quick-eyed love. What happens? He grows slack. Those words, meaning and sound, are always caught up together. We know this, of course, because if I said to you, hurry up, tum, tum, tum. Or if I said to you, slow down. So here it is, you know, his soul is elongated and heavy, grows slack, drew back. But love is sprightly. Yeah. Some of you have heard me tell this story, so forgive me. Hopefully some of you haven't. But I was brought up by my grandparents, and my grandfather was in the RAF in the war, Second World War. And he would never talk to me as a boy about his experiences, except once in a car, together he started to cry. And I remember it, I think I was about 11, and he mentioned the word Dresden, and I didn't know what that meant. He died when I was 14. I have since read up. I now have his logbook. He was in Bomber Command. And I strangely was invited to go and preach in Dresden, in Frauenkirche there. And on my way, he was very much in my mind as I went around the city, of course. And when I left, I got into a taxi, and the taxi driver was looking in the mirror at me, and he said, have you enjoyed being here? And I said, yes, I've always wanted to come. It's been wonderful. And the driver said, why have you always wanted to come here? And so I took a deep breath, and I just said, well, I was brought up by my grandfather. I have his logbook. He would never talk to me about what he did. But I do know that on the 14th of February, 1945, he was part of the bombing raid here. And he's been in my thoughts. And the taxi driver was quiet. And then he said, that was the night my mother was killed. And he pulled the taxi over and turned the engine off. And then he looked round at me at the back and said, and now you and I, we shake hands. And we shook hands, and we were silent. He took me to the station. I went to pay, and he said, no, you and I will remember this day for the rest of our lives. And I got on the train to Berlin, phoned my grandmother, and told her, and she burst into tears because she remembers the husband who can never talk about any of this. And when I was on the train, I promise you, the only thing I could keep thinking about was, love took my hand and smiling did reply. Because it's exactly what that man did. He took my hand smiling. And whereas it would have been so easy to be loyal to the past and be defensive or quiet, that taxi driver was loyal to the future. He took my hand. And I just thought, George Herbert knew that 400 years ago. And I've just been taught it by a taxi driver I shall never meet again. And I now can't read this poem without thinking of him. A man I shall never know, but there is something of what he did in the nature of God, and Herbert knew it. And in a lot of his poems, he is taken by his hand. There's an image for resurrection for him is being taken so that he might rise with Christ. You know, I've risen, come with me. Get that image very strong. Let's look at, do you want to look at one more poem before we go home? Let's look at a resurrection poem. I know it's Lent. If you want to be Lenten, read Virtue when you get home, because you are dust, and to dust you shall return. There's a beautiful poem that reminds you of that, Virtue. But let's look at the dawning. I'll probably ask you just to have 3 or 4 minutes talking about this to see what you make of it. This is not a very well-known poem. I love it, but see what you make of it. The dawning. Awake, sad heart, whom sorrow ever drowns. Take up thine eyes, which feed on earth. Unfold thy forehead, gathered into frowns. Thy Saviour comes, and with him mirth. Awake, awake, and with a thankful heart his comforts take. But thou dost still lament and pine and cry, and feel his death, but not his victory. Arise, sad heart. If thou dost not withstand Christ's resurrection, thine may be. Do not by hanging down break from the hand which, as it riseth, raiseth thee. Arise, arise, and with his burial linen dry thine eyes. Christ left his grave clothes that we might when grief draws tears or blood, not want a handkerchief. Let's turn to your neighbour for a couple of minutes. Time is edging on, and we finish in a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to see if people like that poem. Did many of you know? No. That's not well known. This image of using that he left his grave clothes behind so that you can wipe your tears away is an unusual one and rather striking, I think. But there again, you find that image. Do not by hanging down break from the hand, which as it raiseth thee. And it's very similar to those orthodox icons you often get of Christ, the resurrected Christ standing on this rather precarious looking bridge. And there's Adam and there's Eve. And if you remember, they, were blaming one another last time we saw them. No, it was him. No, it was she did it. Oh, the snake. And there's Christ pulling them out of their hell of complaint and accusation, and pulling them out, but not only pulling them out, but pulling them towards each other again. Yeah. So that hands are a key part there of resurrection, visibly, and Herbert picks up the theme, I think, in his poems. So Herbert, for me, is of interest to anybody who's interested in Christian faith, who wants to discover a poet who, frankly, religion is not about the warm shallows. Christian faith is not like something you do on a Wednesday evening, if you've got time and you're not doing your basket weaving, or I might do religion. This is serious. This is about honesty, it's about growth, it's about pretense and how you can be saved from it. And Evelyn Underhill once said that the only interesting thing about religion at the end of the day is God. And that's what his poems are about. And I do think quite often at the moment we're trapped into languages about religion that you either get, frankly, ignorance on fire or intelligence on ice. So you get sort of passionate, sort of literalistic, inhumane often, against a very analytical, cold numbness. And what you get in Herbert, I think, is something very much in between that. You get this desire to reason with God, to talk to God, to unveil yourself to God, but you also get this sense that actually, if I can put it this way, you cannot have God's revelation without human re-evaluation. So revelation leads to a re-evaluation. And every time God reveals something in the poem, Herbert has to rethink. And he has to take his becoming very seriously. Who am I becoming? And where is he going to help me grow a bit more? So I'm very pleased to talk about George Herbert. And next week we will talk about somebody he knew and also wrote poems. I'm going to end by just reading the poem Jordan on page 5. Jordan, by the way, of course, the river, again, there's another little key, what happens in the Jordan. Certain people are cured from leprosy in the Jordan. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan. John the Baptist, the prophet, is preaching by the Jordan. So all these images come into one little title. When first my lines of heavenly joys made mention, such was their lustre, they did so excel, that I sought out quaint words and trim invention. My thoughts began to burnish, sprout, and swell. curling with metaphors of plain intention, decking the sense as if it were to sell. Thousands of notions in my brain did run, offering their service if I were not spared. I often blotted what I had begun. This was not quick enough, and that was dead. Nothing could seem too rich to clothe the sun, much less those joys which trample on his head. As flames do work and wind when they ascend, so did I weave myself into the sense. But while I bustled, I might hear a friend whisper, how wide is all this long pretense? There is in love a sweetness ready penned. Copy out only that and save expense. There you get Herbert's God, who is the friend, who's whispering, who's helping him with his pretense, and reminding him that there is in love a sweetness. Thank you very much.
Thank you.